Does this look familiar? Has this ever happened to you before? Today we're going to talk about the phenomenon of rowing out when you're knitting stockinette, and we're going to talk about what causes it and what we can do to prevent it. Hey there, welcome. My name is Felicia from SweetGeorgia and also the School of SweetGeorgia. And we've been talking a little bit about knitting and purling these past couple of weeks and how to form all of those stitches. Now today we're going to talk about some of the issues that can be created when there's a difference in the tension between the rows that you work in knit stitches and the rows that you work in purl stitches. And so you get this phenomenon that's called rowing out. And so if you look at it from the back side, from the purl side, and you can do a close-up of this and I'll show you, but you can see that from the back side of your work, you'll see that there's a little bit of a gap between some of those purl rows. And it looks almost like a farmer's field that has been plowed. And so there's these little gaps in your knitting on the back side. And then when you look at it from the front side, you'll be able to see that some of those knit stitches on certain rows are a little bit elongated. They're a tiny bit more stretched out. And so why does this happen? So I have been knitting this swatch in some mop cotton. This is 100% cotton yarn. And I'm just doing this because I can show you the rowing out in a very inelastic yarn. Rowing out tends to be a little bit more obvious in inelastic yarn like cotton or linen, but it can also happen in wool yarns. It might just be a little bit less noticeable. You might not even notice it until you finish a sweater and then you're like, that looks different. That's not what I was expecting. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you can minimize this by either changing your tools or adjusting how you work your stitches. So rowing out happens when the amount of yarn that's being used in a knit stitch is different than the amount of yarn being used in a purl stitch. When you're working stockinette back and forth flat, you are knitting a row of knit stitches and then you flip it over and then you knit a row of purl stitches. Now those two rows are supposed to look perfectly identical. Now if the amount of yarn that you have used for knit stitches is different than the amount of yarn that you've used for all those purl stitches, you're not going to get two identical rows of knitting. One will be a little bit bigger and one will be a little bit smaller. So you can see from the last couple of videos, we worked knit stitches in a Western fashion, either by holding your yarn in your right hand for English style or lever style, or holding it in your left hand for continental or Norwegian style. And then when you're forming all of those purl stitches, we talked about wrapping over or wrapping under or maybe combination knitting. So however you are knitting your knit stitches and how you're purling your purl stitches, you'll have to look at your work and make sure that the tension is the same after you finish a knit row and after you finish a purl row. So managing your tension is absolutely essential to make sure that those stitches look the same. The knit stitches all have to look the same as all your purl stitches in order so that your stockinette will be perfectly consistent and even no matter what. And for the most part, you may not notice this phenomenon until something happens. Like maybe you are knitting an entire sweater in the round and you're just knitting and knitting and knitting in the round in a circular fashion, and then all of a sudden you have to divide for armholes. And so then you start to knit flat, and all of a sudden you'll start to notice that something happens from this point where from the armholes up, your gauge starts to look a little bit different, a little bit wonky and different from what you were knitting below. And this is 100% because you are no longer forming just knit stitches. Now you're working knit and purl stitches. So maybe your purls are at a slightly tighter gauge or a slightly looser gauge, and this is what causes that irregularity to happen. But it's kind of a tricky thing because we are doing two different processes. A knit stitch is formed one way and a purl stitch is formed a different way. So how do we make sure that those two different techniques produce the exact same looking stitch? First, it takes some practice. It takes a little bit of work. So some knitters will change their tension when they're purling without even realizing it. And so what is important to know is that we actually have to swatch. So in one of the past videos, we were talking about combination knitting, and I referred you to this book, Knitting in the Old Way by Priscilla Gibson Roberts and Deb Robeson. And so this one has an entire section talking about rowing out. So that's their little section about rowing out. They even have a little illustration of what that looks like. Then if you happen to have this book, this is a fantastic book by June Hemmons Hyatt. Now, this it's a classic book. This is the book of all books for all knitters. This is called The Principles of Knitting. And in this book alone, there's like, look at how huge this is. There's 30 pages in here just talking about gauge. And so there is one section where June specifically describes change in tension on knit and purl rows. She never actually names this as rowing out, but she describes it exactly the same way. It's this idea that there's a gutter that you can see between the rows on your purl side. And so the thing is that before you start on any project, you actually do need to make a gauge swatch. It's really important to know what your gauge is going to be with your own knitting. If you are knitting flat back and forth for stockinette, or if you're knitting in the round, you should knit your gauge swatch in the same method that you're going to be using for your project. So if you are knitting a top-down sweater entirely in the round and you never have to knit back and forth, then you should do a swatch in the round. And if you're going to knit a sweater flat back and forth, then you should knit a swatch flat back and forth. And if you're going to knit a sweater where you have to knit circular and then divide for armholes and then knit flat back and forth, you should really make a swatch of both techniques and make sure that they match. So knitting that swatch is going to give you some information about what your stitches are going to look like, what your stockinette is going to look like when you knit in the technique that you knit in. So many, many years ago, I started the process of doing the Master Knitter program for TKGA. It's the Knitting Guild of America. And I tried this maybe like 15, 20 years ago. I started down this path and I knit something like 30 different swatches and all these kinds of things. And I discovered that some of my swatches had some rowing out. And so I had to do some research to figure out what to do to fix the situation. Now, one of the solutions that I came across is that maybe you should use different size needles for the rows that you purl and a different size needle for your knit stitches. So the idea being that if your purls happen to be very, very loose, maybe you have to go down a needle size when you do your purl rows and then have your regular needle size for your knit rows. But I feel like that would be very confusing for me because I would forget which needle size is for which hand and all these kinds of things. I would get totally lost with that situation. So I think maybe a better approach might be to actually manage the tension in your knitting method, in your hands, in order to produce better overall fabric. And so this is, of course, going to require practice. So I would concentrate on knitting and purling to ensure consistent tension for all of the stitches. Now, what I think is really helpful is that when you are switching between your knit row and your purl row, you should look at the stitches on your right hand needle, the ones that have just been formed, and kind of check that they have an appropriate amount of tension. So I've just finished knitting some of these stitches. They're on my right hand needle, and I just want to make sure that they have like an appropriate amount of slide on the needles, not so tight that they won't move, but not so loose that there's a gaping hole under the stitch. So you don't want the stitches to slide right off the needles, that's too loose, but it's kind of about finding a tension that is not too tight and not too loose. And so then when you go and you purl, you also want to make sure that the stitches slide the same amount. Again, if your purls are much tighter, then you're going to find that the stitches don't really slide on that right hand needle very much as you're working those purl stitches. So you just kind of want to check and make sure that you're getting the right amount or the ideal amount of tension in all of your stitches, whether you're doing knits or purls. And so that's just a matter of practicing and looking at your stitches that are being formed. You want to make sure that the yarn is wrapping around the needle and not forming a big hole at the bottom and not being so tight. So it's just right. So I found that as I was practicing combination knitting, the amount of yarn that I used for combination purl was slightly less. And so it would make these tighter stitches. So I had to really consciously loosen up my tension on those combination purls in order to make that kind of knitting style more normal looking. But with my English style, I've been doing this for so long that it's just become much more consistent over time. And so continuing on with that TKGA Master Knitter program, I did figure out how to prevent my own rowing out, and I just practiced and practiced to develop a little bit more consistency with my tension. Once I had knit some of these swatches and seen it face to face, realized, oh, there's a lot of room for improvement here towards becoming a master knitter. I just started to practice more and again, try to produce the most even fabric possible. So again, my most practical recommendation is just to practice knitting more consistently and really observe your work. You know, you flip over your work often, check that your tension is good on both sides if you're knitting stockinette flat back and forth. You check your tension on your right hand needle, make sure that those stitches are sliding appropriately, not too tight, not too loose, and that just look at how you're forming of those stitches and think about if you are actually accidentally or unconsciously tightening some of those knits or purls as you're forming them. So whether it's a knit row or a purl row, just always be checking your stitches on that right hand needle to make sure that you've put in that right amount of tension. So for me, it's really about managing your own hands so that you can knit really consistent stitches no matter what. I talk about this all the time, this idea with spinning. It's not about the wheel that you use, if you use a treadle wheel or an e-spinner or a drop spindle or whatever. Spinning happens in your hands. It happens between your fingers, and it's that feel. And I think it's the same thing with knitting. Knitting happens, your fingers are feeling those stitches, what is happening, and you get a tactile feedback of if this is enough tension, not enough tension, all of that. So the goal is, even if you knit very slowly, it's not necessarily about knitting fast. It's about forming beautiful, high quality stitches that have even tension, and that will produce the best looking fabric for you and your projects. Thank you so much for being here to talk about inconsistencies in knitting tension. I know it sounds like a very, very specific topic, but it affects the entire appearance of your knitted projects. So it's actually really, really important. If you have any thoughts or comments or suggestions on what you have done to avoid rowing out, I would love to hear them. These are some of the techniques that I came across in the past. And if you want to learn more about knitting, we have lots of knitting classes that cover all sorts of different techniques, from color work to cables to lace to designing your own projects, and many more coming soon for the School of SweetGeorgia. You can join us over there as well. Thank you so much for watching this. I will see you in the next one. All right, bye for now.